I'm Fiona Howarth.
And I'm Amy Rennison. And this is the Earthset podcast.
In our first podcast, we're talking with James Arbib, co-author of Stellar, A World Beyond Limits, and How to Get There. This episode was recorded at Mother London as part of our Earthset event in September 2025.
It's a fascinating conversation about how technology and clean energy could completely transform the way we live and work, from the extractive economy we're stuck in now to what he calls the stellar world and what could come next.
It's big, it's hopeful, surprisingly grounded. We hope you enjoy it. Massive kudos to all of you for turning up this evening. Really massively appreciate it. Particularly because, as Will alluded to, this is a super exciting book and some really fascinating thinking, which, I've seen a bunch of trends and I've been like, how is this all going to play out? And this is the first time that I have seen some kind of vision around what this could be, and also potentially a really positive vision, but with some potential pitfalls on the way. So, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and also for bringing a bunch of books. So if you haven't yet seen them, there's a pile of books over there, and you guys are all allowed to take one with you, but there's a condition that you can take one, but you also need to get another one for someone else. So we share the book love, okay? Jamie, you're here today. When did the book publish? And give us a bit of a rundown of what you did before this and what brought you to this moment.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Amy. And obviously, thank you, Fiona, for the softball questions you're about to throw my way. So the book was published 6 months ago, so back in March. And it's kind of almost a kind of culmination, I think, of my journey with Tony Sieber, who's my co-author. We're still going to carry on doing plenty of stuff together, but we met 9 years ago now, and I'm like, have we got time for me to kind of give a bit of color and a bit of background?
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, Tony, I'd been working in kind of clean technology venture capital. I'd been an investor. I'd been also very involved in the kind of climate movement. I'd been funding a number of kind of initiatives in that space. And I'd begun back in, I don't know, this must have been 2010, 2012, sometime then, to get really frustrated with the environmental movement. And the reason for that was that I felt that clean energy, if you understood anything about a cost curve, it was kind of clear back in 2010 or 2012 that solar power was going to be the cheapest form of energy on the planet within a decade or so. That was crystal clear. And the economics of solar power was the thing that was going to drive adoption of solar power. And back in those early 2010s, somehow clean energy had been conflated with climate change. And so the whole argument in favor of clean energy was all about, we must have clean energy in order to solve climate change. And that was fine. That was a very valid argument. Of course we do. We all know climate change is a hugely pressing and serious problem that needs addressing. But what was getting ignored were all the other benefits of clean energy. The fact that A, it was going to be the cheapest form of energy. B, that it was better for resilience, national security, all kinds of arguments, all kinds of cards that we could have been playing that were just getting ignored. And to people on the right, they kind of, it was seen as a kind of big government initiative, something that would need more subsidy, more tax, more government regulation, all the kind of stuff they hated. And I kind of had it in my head that actually, something that the right should really appreciate and really support, that it was all about free markets, all about economics. I had this kind of picture in my head, actually, of an advertising campaign, and I'm not an advertising guy. I'm sure this wouldn't have worked, but of a kind of Texan rancher with a kind of pickup truck and a gun and a solar panel, because it was all about, self-sufficiency and independence and so on and so forth, and lack of reliance on kind of, foreign governments. Basically all the stuff the right like. So I'd been working on this project of how do you bridge the partisan divide between left and right, and get kind of support both sides of the aisle. Listen, I've been doing some work in America somehow I ended up, I've been speaking with the US military about a number of different things. And they were running a scenario planning exercise, a group called the Military Advisory Board. And they were basically asking the question, what will it mean if we get off fossil fuels very quickly, right? Or more quickly than we're expecting? What will that mean for geopolitics? And so to kick off this scenario planning exercise, they invited a bunch of experts. And so we had, I think, like eight experts in a room with a bunch of kind of admirals and generals. And it was, Exxon, BP scenario team, the State Department. I can't remember, I think probably Bloomberg, Energy Finance. So some big kind of august institutions. And they all basically stood up and gave the same projections for the adoption of solar, the adoption of electric vehicles and so on, these kind of straight line forecasts out to, 2040, 2050 in some cases. They were kind of super low, super linear. And this guy, I think the other, I guess, I hate to call myself a radical because I don't think of myself that way, but the other guy who had been asked along to give the other side or the other opinion, I guess, was a guy called Tony Seba, who'd written a book quite recently back then called The Clean Disruption. And he basically stood up and said, look, this is not how technology disruptions work. They're not these kind of slow, linear, incremental progressions, right? They're rapid, they're non-linear, they go along an S-curve. He said, these things are over in the 2030s. If you're going to make your plans based on these faulty forecasts, you're going to make some big mistakes. And I was the last speaker, and I got up and I basically just said, look, I agree with Tony. And anyway, the two of us got talking after that, and we went for coffee, and then we spent a few months just kind of calling each other up and chatting, because we both had the opinion that the economy, particularly society more generally, was on the cusp of a major transformation. It wasn't just energy and transportation; it was food and agriculture. It was education and healthcare. That every major system, every major part of the economy was about to go through this profound transformation, and no one understood either how quickly it was going to happen or how profoundly it was going to change things and the kind of cascading consequences of change. So we ended up setting up an organization called Rethink X, which was a not-for-profit research group together back in, it must have been 2016, we set that up with a mission, literally, to provide leaders across society with better information on which to take decisions. And that was a kind of the start of our journey. And as we've been walking that road together, we've published a series of reports on various sectors of the economy. But Stellar was the thing we wanted to get to, because Stellar's looking at a much broader transformation, not just the transformation of individual sectors of the economy, which is the work we did at Rethink X, but actually a transformation of civilization itself, the kind of the possibility space that we're existing in. And we wanted to write that really from the outset, but we just didn't have the evidence and we didn't have the kind of the depth of understanding. And so, we finally got there. And this was a kind of the last, I think, when we set up, we thought it would take us a couple of years, just the two of us working part-time. And it ended up being, 9 years with a team full-time, essentially. And anyway, we got that.
Yeah. And actually, if we take that book, Clean Disruption, Tony's book,
yeah.
And when he stood up and he made those projections in that room, 10 years ago,
yeah,
and everyone else was there saying, it's to be really flat, in terms of growth. Actually, everyone else has been proven wrong. And Tony has been remarkable.
Tony's been pretty much spot on. If you look back at his projections back in the book, Clean Disruption, that was published in 2014. The cost curve of solar and the cost curve of electric vehicles has pretty much followed exactly as he drew back then. And the adoption curve's been remarkably similar. So, and everyone else is miles away. You've seen those graphs of their kind of predictions rising to catch up with reality. But, none of them were anywhere near.
And in the book, so we're going to go through the book a bit. So you had a bit of a background and a bit of a snapshot of what might be coming in terms of some of these trends. But basically, the book, you go through where we're at today and the kind of society that we live in today. Then you talk about what the stellar world could look like. And then you talk a bit about a path to get there.
Yeah.
I'm desperate to get into stellar world now because you've just teed it up so nicely. But I feel like we're going to take a step back and we're going to just pause, because talking about the extraction economy that we have today is really important to help us understand also where we need to go and what we need to do to get there. So do you want to just talk about that a bit? And then also the system change.
Yeah.
and how that works.
Okay, so we'll start with extraction. So extraction is how we describe the world we live in today. And it took us a long time to understand this, actually. We were really trying to kind of get to the root some of the issues that we're facing in the world. This is where the exploration started. And it led us to kind of dig and dig and dig to really understand, what's really driving the world? Why does it feel so crazy? Why don't we really understand what's going on? Why can no one kind of see what's happening? The world of extraction, the analogy we use for it is a fire, right? It's like a fire, and that you need this constant flow of kind of inputs to keep it going, right? So if you build a fire, you want a constant flow of wood, and you need labor to deliver that wood, and you need, the materials and so on and so forth. And you also get, along with the kind of the useful output, the light and the heat that you want from the fire, you also get a bunch of smoke and ashes and kind of things that you don't. So at the simplest level, that's how we describe extraction. And it's a paradigm that we've been in 10,000 or so years now. It came in with the Neolithic Revolution. We moved from being hunters and gatherers to living in settlements and farming, essentially. And it was at that point in time, we sort of inadvertently stepped into a whole new world. And it's that world that essentially drives everything we see in society today. So when you operate in a world where you need to go and get external inputs, right? If you're an economist, you call those land, labor, and capital, right? You need land, labor, and capital to produce anything that you need. You might think of it as people and planet. That's another way of describing the same thing. So you need to get, materials. I mean, land refers to both obviously land, but also resources. You need inputs, right? Whether they're metals or energy, but you also need labor. And you need a constant supply. But those things are external to the system, right? And they're also what we call excludable. Right? And excludable means, either I have it or you have it, right? So they're essentially scarce. So when you're in that world, you're essentially in a world of, competition. And we think of that as this kind of the evolutionary context of civilization. And by that, we mean what we see in society in terms of our political, economic, social structures are the things that have won out, had some kind of competitive advantage, and outcompeted other alternatives. There are all kinds of ways in which we can organize society, right? Our economy, our political system, our social structure. But what we see through history is the same things winning out time and time again. And the reason they win out is because they have an advantage. Right? So we see, if you go back, the book starts, and we have sort of 40 or 50 pages of history. We go back to kind of Sumer, right? The first great civilization back 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And you see private ownership, right? You see central government, and you see hierarchies. You see sort of command and control structures. You see money. You see debt. You see, the nuclear family emerge. You see basically the same kind of, at their root, you see the same political, social, economic systems. And we've seen them time and time again. It's not to say it's the only way we can organize society. We've tried all kinds of other ways, right, over time. But the ones that best catalyze growth, right, that essentially give you a competitive advantage are the things that went out. Right. And so you can't kind of slow down or go back, because if you try to, if you want to live sustainably, right, or you want to live equitably, right, you're kind of hamstrung in how far you can go to do that. Because, in a system like that, you have issues that are kind of inherent in that system. You have to constantly grow or you get out competed. So, the exploitation of people and the exploitation of planet kind of hardwired into that system. Right, they're the essence of that system. Right? They're kind of features, not bugs. And so you can't just unilaterally decide to live equitably or sustainably. Plenty of civilizations have tried to do that, but they've just been outcompeted by others that don't. Right, so once they fall within reach of a civilization that's essentially driven by what we call the growth imperative, they just get outcompeted. And so, time and time we see the same thing. So that's really the essence of extraction. And because those problems are hardwired into the system, right, they're not solvable. Right. All you can do is make them a bit less bad. Right. So that's what we're trying to do basically now with inequality and climate change and other environmental issues. They're not solvable in extraction. All you can do is kind of band-aid them. You can do what you can to make them a bit less bad, but you can only go to the extent that it doesn't really affect your growth, or else you're going to get outcompeted by someone else who isn't driven by the same pressure. So that's what extraction is. That's the kind of the world we live in now. And it's a world that's kind of reaching its limit, right? We've seen time and time again with civilizations, they kind of grow through these kind of huge growth periods and they kind of reach their limits. They overexpand and then they collapse. And that's been the history of civilizations, through 2 steps forward and collapse 1 step back. And we're now at a kind of global civilization. We can't really expand anymore, and we're reaching those limits again.
I liked it in the book. You imagine sitting in one of those taverns with a hunter-gatherer sitting there with someone for the Sumer civilization with like America today. And actually the similarity between that civilization post the Neolithic Revolution with the hunter-gatherer, though, that would not recognize it at all. But actually, to your point, with the debt, with the, money and everything that came with that Neolithic Revolution is actually still very similar to what we see today. And also the differences in terms of like it's at an individual level. Like, I don't know if anyone's got kids and you're thinking, well, what are they going to do when they grow up? Because we all need to be on that, like treadmill. It's like, what's our job going to be? Because we need to be able to afford food, to be able to afford energy. Actually, we need to be able to get to work. So even if we want to stop, producing carbon emissions, it's really hard to get off the treadmill. Yeah. Even as individuals, all the way through to economy level and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, all we're really saying in the book is, look, that route, that system of extraction, the production system we're in, that determines or drives, what wins out in terms of how we organize society, in terms of the problems we face, but also in terms of how we are as humans. And that's some piece I miss out, which is super important. The argument we make is very much that human nature is kind of variable, that we as humans are capable of a huge range of ways of thinking, huge range of emotions and behaviors and ways of interrelating. But the extractive context drives us towards certain behaviors. Things like greed and aggression are rewarded in a system of extraction. That actually it pays to think in a kind of narrow, linear way. Right? We want to know that I do this to that and I get this outcome. Right? I dig this trench, to bring water to my field and my crops grow more. You don't want to be thinking about the cascading consequences, the kind of holistic picture that in 50 years' time, my soil is going to be salinated and my crops won't grow so much because, the guy down the river is going to be, salinating his soils. But in the meantime, concurrently, he's going to have a surplus that he can put to work. And so, even the way we think, is determined by extraction. And then the argument we make is the reason we think in this kind of very separated world, this kind of, this duality that we live in, really comes from that moment of time that actually, in a very real sense in this world, people and planet are separate, right? They are inputs into the system. And it affects us at a very kind of base level.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right, because often we think about that separation of us versus the planet, where we have become so disconnected from what we're consuming. But also, actually, we're consuming labor, right? There's a lot of labor that's going into this to keep it going. And actually, the economies need that labor and they need more people to keep everything going and keep growing and to keep on that growth mission.
Yeah, no, we are exploited inputs into the system, right? We have to sell our labor. That's the way we survive. And it's, people have, every major civilization until, relatively recently has had slavery at its core, at least every successful.
And so at one point you touched on patriarchy in the book and all the labor that goes actually unpaid for by a huge number of predominantly women, so that stay at home, look after children, all carers across society as well, where, the way that society is structured, there's a whole load of unpaid labor as well.
Yeah, and that gives your society an advantage. If you can harness unpaid labor, you have the most efficient form of production, right? And it's, yeah.
So there's a lot more in the book. You want to dig into the extraction economy, but given it's a bit sad, we're going to paint a different picture of what this could look like. Now, you touched on it a bit earlier with solar and the cost of solar plummeting, right? Cost of wind power plummeting, battery power. Now, so those of you that don't know me, by the way, I'm Fiona, and I work in electric vehicles. And actually, by the way, Tony Seba was first introduced to me by Mark Goodyear. Did anyone used to listen to the Top 40 in the 90s? Mark Goodyear, the radio DJ. I was on a Tesla trip with him like 8 years ago, and I was sitting there, and he's had electric cars since 2004. And he was like, there's a great book. You need to read Clean Disruption. Here we go. Mark Goodyear has been spreading the Tony Seba word. But anyway, so I had been a bit nerdy of this space for a while, and I was like, this is a no-brainer, right? But actually, the possibilities with clean energy, you brought to life for me in an even greater way than I'd even imagined it myself. So talk us through that, talk us through the possibilities, and then some of the other trends that are also going to completely disrupt.
All right, before we dive into the stellar world, let's talk about technology first of all, because I think what Tony has been doing, well before I met him, and what we've been doing at Rethink X is trying to understand how change happens, right? How disruption unfolds, and I think should we do energy or transport? What should we?
Let's go transport today.
Should we do transport? So guys, I've been doing energy so much that we can do a bit of both. So I mean, there are sort of three things we need to understand about change, at least in the economy. The first is kind of the processes of change, and I kind of briefly referred to the S curve before, and it's really important to understand how that works. The second is what we refer to that again, is the nature of change. The fact that the system that emerges is very, very different to the system that we've been in. That it's not just a kind of substitution of technology. And then the third thing we have to think about the kind of the cascading impacts of change. So in terms of transportation, I mean, this is the first thing we did. We haven't revisited it since, but I still think it kind of holds roughly. We published a report in beginning of 2017. It's a long time ago now, isn't it? And what we are basically saying is, look, there are sort of a number of technologies that are kind of converging, that are coming together, that are going to transform transport. So, battery technology was dropping dramatically. We had vehicle autonomy being developed, and we had kind of ride hailing emerging as a possibility. When you put all those together, essentially what you get is a possibility of robo-taxis, right? What we call transport as a service. So, a totally different form of transportation. And the reason we think that that's the real disruption that's coming to transport is that electric vehicles are getting cheaper and cheaper. We can all see that. They're pretty much the same cost now as gasoline vehicles, and they're going to continue to get cheaper. We're at the inflection point, really, where gasoline vehicles are going to continue to get more expensive. But the really kind of the real advantage that electric vehicles have is that they essentially kind of last forever. Right? They have 20 moving parts compared to 2,000 moving parts in a gasoline vehicle, right? So, we see batteries today that can last 1 million miles. I mean, we could be making, it's a kind of chemistry tweak. We could be making 2 million mile batteries. Right? They last forever. But that, and same for electric motors, right? But that doesn't really give you any advantage in a private ownership model, right? Because we do sort of 10,000 miles a year, and your car sits idle. What is it? 96% of the time, and so. In that model, an electric car doesn't really have a kind of big advantage. But if that car is driving around all the time, and you're doing 100,000 miles a year instead of, 10,000 miles a year or more even, then it becomes useful mileage, right? And you can spread the cost. If you're doing 1 million miles in that vehicle over 5 or 10 years, you can spread the cost of the vehicle, which is really the big cost of an electric car, over 1 million miles or 2 million miles, or however long it's going to last. And that gives you a super low cost of transport, especially when you add the cost of, electricity and the fact that they don't really need servicing if you build them in the right way. So you get to this model of transportation. And the last thing to unlock it is obviously vehicle autonomy. But you get to a model where you really have, very, very low per mile cost of transport. And we speculated in the report that we published that in cities, that actually you probably have free transport because you'd have to find other ways of monetizing that vehicle fleet, advertising, sponsorship, data, all kinds of things that might even talked about having kind of Starbucks on wheels, things like that. There'll be, it would open a whole new possibility space, right? And a whole new, and then still we feel is the disruption, and we're getting very close to the point now where autonomy is good enough. And once we get there, this disruption will happen like that, totally transformative and very different.
I think it's a really good point, your Starbucks and wheels, because also some of the other points you make in the book is that technology disruption has always brought more opportunities than we could imagine at times. So like faster horses, actually cars brought so many more opportunities than we could have imagined when we were riding horses, for example.
That's right. So when the car replaced the horse, right, it wasn't just a faster horse, right? It was something else entirely. Right? Cars transformed how we built our cities, right? Where we lived, where we sited our schools, where we sited our hospitals. It changed the type of jobs we did actually and how far we travel for work. I mean, it changed all kinds of things. It changed, global geopolitics. It solved one set of environmental problems and created a host of other ones. It had a cascade of consequences, and it wasn't just a faster horse. It was something else entirely.
Yeah, and maybe you're sitting there just now thinking, if I had completely free travel, how would that change my life? What would I do differently? Like, would I still go and get the tube on the way here to, Mother? Would I get in a autonomous Uber that might bring me here and be able to do my email while I don't know what you might do. But also then some of the other things that you put forward is like then zero cost or near zero cost energy.
Yeah.
And along with that, loads of other things as well. So
yeah, and essentially a superabundance, right? As well, and I'll come back to that. So energy is something we've written extensively about as another really interesting disruption. So again, solar, wind, batteries, right, on these extraordinary cost curves, getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But the way if you model every type of energy system you can build, every type of clean energy system you can build, it becomes abundantly clear that the cheapest system you can build, including all other sources, is a clean energy system. And then you build it in a very different way to the way we're building it today. And so what you do is you supersize the system, right? You size it for the darkest day of winter, because storage is a really expensive part. You don't want to be moving, energy from summer when you've got lots of sunshine into winter. You just want to overbuild it. Right, because solar panels are getting so cheap. They're 90% cheaper than they were a decade ago, and they're going to continue to get cheaper. And they're actually being built into buildings, so actually they have almost no surplus cost. Right, they become part of the very fabric of our society. Eventually, they already are becoming that way. So we're going to get super cheap generation. So you just massively overbuild energy so that you've got enough energy on the darkest day of winter. Right, and as a byproduct, building the cheapest possible system you can build, what happens is you get this superabundance of energy every other day of the year, right? You get far more than you need. And we call that superpower. And that's the thing that transforms the energy sector, right? It just creates a host of new possibilities, right? Not just for existing industries, right? Which will have lower cost power, but also the possibility of kind of free power at certain times of the year. It will drive people to use power flexibly, essentially, all favor. So what we'll see is every existing industry will kind of self-organize, will just adapt itself to that new energy paradigm. But they'll find new ways to use energy. Right now, we try and minimize energy use. Like we kind of, energy efficiency is really high on the list of things that we need to do, partly for economic benefits, right? And so we drive down energy consumption in those kinds of ways. It transforms it. It means that you can use, all this surplus energy to do pretty much anything. So we'll transform existing energy, existing industries because of this transformation. But actually, the really interesting thing is what else can you do with that energy? Right. And it's an almost unimaginable possibility space. So when we're talking in somewhere like the UK, 3 to 4 times as much energy produced by this system over the course of the year, almost as a byproduct. Right? And it's the use cases and applications that we find for that energy that actually is going to create all the value, right? And it's, what might we do with it? Well, I mean, it's they're endless. We can't imagine, all the things we'll do, but some of the things we can see, things like vertical farming, right? In an industry where about 80% of the cost is energy suddenly becomes viable in a way that it just can't compete in the current market. We could make all kinds of materials. We can do precision fermentation, right? Make proteins, essentially, cultured meats. The cost of all these things comes down dramatically. They become tentative, and then eventually outperform, other forms of food production. That there are so many potential use cases. And it's one of these things that those use cases will emerge as we enter that paradigm, as entrepreneurs and others just begin to experiment and find ways to use this power, because it will be, so when we talk about transformation, we often use the analogy of a caterpillar and a butterfly, right? The idea that the old system is like a caterpillar and the new system's a butterfly. This comes from a Buckminster Fuller quote that we love, which is that there's nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it's going to become a butterfly, right? So we tend to understand the current system, and we assume that the new system is just the old system with different technology. Right? It's not. It's something fundamentally different, a whole different kind of possibility space. We refer to that kind of hybrid system as a caterpillar with wings stuck on. And it's never going to fly. And that's kind of what we're doing in the UK and other major markets right now. Like, we're building this chimera. We're sticking wings on a caterpillar and expecting it to fly. And so we're shoehorning kind of solar and wind and batteries into the old centralized system. The market structure, the business model, the infrastructure that was built of fossil fuels, which are totally different technologies. And so, a solar wind battery system is much more distributed, could be done at much smaller scale, needs to be responsive, needs to be two-way to get the full benefits. When you build this chimera, this caterpillar with wings, you don't get really any of the benefits of the new technologies, and you get a host of problems. And that's why today, as we're seeing the cost of solar plummet, right, the cost of batteries plummet, and we're seeing adoption skyrocket, consumers are paying more, right? It's this crazy situation where we're essentially trying to shoehorn these new technologies into an old system. We could be building a system that just outcompetes everything else, right? And that's how change happens, right? Someone somewhere in some part of the world will build this system, and they'll just begin to outcompete. They'll attract investment, they'll attract industry, they'll have the lowest cost energy, and it will spread that way.
I mean, I think we're seeing that at the minute in the energy sector. Up in Scotland, the cheapest energy in Europe. Actually, we've got a huge amount of wind. But actually, we're seeing, data centers being relocated in other European markets where they've got different structures and different grid structures and different, setups. And so because we can't offer the cheap electricity that we're generating in that way.
Yeah, we'll build demand wherever the supply is, essentially, ultimately.
So we can come back to that debate. So I want to continue to talk a bit about the butterfly a bit, and not quite how we avoid the caterpillar with wings. But so because the butterfly isn't just about the energy, actually, all the cool cars that you might be coming to your next event, but it's also about AI and some of the opportunities that's going to bring, but also some of the challenges that will bring as well with it. So, along with energy and abundant energy, by the way, as a side note for you in the audience, later on, I'm going to get a Slido up and ask you what you would do with abundant green energy. So just pick a thought into that for a few minutes while we carry on talking. But so as well as the energy and the tech and the cars and transport, what is AI also going to unlock for us?
Yeah, so we use the term in the book AL, which is artificial labor, which is the idea. It's intelligence plus robotics, right? Gives you kind of labor. That's what we provide. We provide both physical labor and intelligence, and ultimately we can have a debate about timeline, right? But the direction of travel is that at some point in the next decades, AL, artificial labor, will be able to do everything we do, and do it better. Right, and I think there's very little doubt about that, right? And that can be terrifying, right? We can see that we can fear joblessness, or we can embrace kind of freedom from labor. It's kind of it's a perspective, but what we're seeing in artificial intelligence is just extraordinary progress, and it will take over. It will take over in pretty much every domain in which we create value right now. And so, it's both terrifying, but also potentially hugely liberating.
And so in this stellar world, you're going to talk about how we've got, artificial labor, abundant green, low cost, zero cost energy. And basically we end up with all of our material needs met.
Yeah. Yeah. So we describe, both say solar, wind, batteries and, artificial labor as stellar technologies, right? And if you remember the analogy I used with the fire at the beginning to describe extractive technology, you can think of fossil fuel powered energy or, even us as extractive technologies, essentially. What we have with a solar panel, for instance, at its simplest, is that it requires a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of materials, a huge amount of intelligence to design and build it. But once it's built, it requires nothing else, right? It just radiates output. And same with artificial intelligence, right? And robotics, right? A lot of energy, a lot of materials, a lot of investment to build. But at a certain point in time, it begins to self-improve, right? It begins to write itself, essentially. The intelligence essentially becomes embodied within the technology, right? And at a certain point in time, it needs nothing else from the outside. That's a stellar technology. It's a technology that doesn't require external inputs, right? So no land, labor, capital from the outside. So that all of these technologies, they need a huge amount of inputs to build, but you get to a certain point where they then need nothing else from the outside, and they produce a kind of superabundance. You can imagine the first robot fleet, 20, 30 years down the line that replaces human labor, right, will have all the materials embodied in it, essentially to provide labor indefinitely, right, into the future. And actually more and more labor, right? Those first robots, just with software updates, right, will provide, a superabundance of labor, as they get kind of broken down and rebuilt, obviously by the robots and intelligence themselves. They'll produce even more output. So you get, curve essentially up towards the limits of physics, where we get superabundant energy, we have superabundant labor, and with superabundant labor and superabundant energy, you have pretty much anything else you want, right? You can make or design or produce, anything. So we have a system that functions fundamentally different. That's not reliant on anything from the outside. And so as you have, I think it's pretty clear to see how both, land and labor, or resources and labor, become embodied in the technology. Capital is less obvious. And if you have capital outside, i.e. you still have private ownership in that model, you just get this very dysfunctional system, right? Where you don't get to zero cost. You don't get, the reason we call these stellar technologies they are like a star, right? And you need a certain amount of materials in the right conditions, right? And the star kind of spontaneously ignites and in perpetuity produces output. It's the same idea of this. We get to a certain ignition point, and our economy essentially will just produce the outputs we need indefinitely with no further inputs, and ever more of them.
This sounds pretty good. Like a world where all of our needs are met. We've got abundant green energy. We've got loads of robots to do all the stuff that we don't want to do. We have loads of time. And what do we do? But when I was talking to someone else about this is going back a few months ago, they're in the audience. They were like, Fiona, this world is coming and people are all going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their jobs, and we're going to need to have really affordable food. We're going to have really affordable housing, really affordable transport. Like these people aren't going to have any money. There's going to be massive inequality because all of the wealth now is going to accrue to the people that own that intelligence, essentially, and maybe own the energy system as well. Because maybe it's not zero cost, maybe it's near zero cost. But, or maybe it's the critical materials that we need to create that stellar world. So actually we end up with massive inequality.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Well, yeah. So we've talked about, where we are today, extraction, and this, this possible future world, stellar world. And it is physically and economically possible to get there, right? But it's nothing more right now than a North Star, right? The challenge is, how do we walk that path to get there? Because it's undoubtedly going to be a difficult road, and it's a road, where incumbents, right, those of us who are doing well out of the current system, are going to be hugely, resistant to that world. And it's a world, it's a path essentially that's unmapped. Right? In many ways, our minds, understandably, are just trapped, inside that box of extraction. Right? It's a world we know. It describes the economics, the sociology, the politics of our current world. And what we're saying is, well, those aren't constant. All of those things will transform, or they'll have to transform if we'd be successful. But that stellar world is a world that is feasible. So our challenge is, how do we get there? And there are plenty of major challenges. I mean, there are technological challenges, in terms of runaway AI or biotechnology and all of those. And I don't think we've got anything kind of new to add to that debate. The challenge is more, about us more than anything. It's about how we think, how we see, and how we kind of let go of all that knowledge and all those interests and all that incumbency, essentially, that's going to hold us back. And one of the things we talk about in the book that we see as a critical challenge is a challenge of private ownership. And, it's funny because, Tony and I over time have been called, both, communists and crazy capitalists, or dirty capitalists, I think was the phrase that someone used, because, and both are right, because, in our view, we need capitalism to get to this world, right? Something that we need, that profit motive, essentially, to drive the investment, to encourage, people to develop these technologies and to drive us down the path. But once we get there, ownership has no role, right? The capital is, a system that needs nothing from outside, needs no private ownership or capitalism, to coordinate, to drive the allocation of those scarce resources, because they're embodied within the technology. And that's kind of difficult it's kind of context dependent, right? And it's difficult for people to get their heads around. But, then what we're likely to do is to build this caterpillar with wings stuck on, right? Rather than going to the stellar butterfly, I will end up with private ownership holding on far longer than it should. And Silicon Valley or China will end up owning the world's labor, right? It'll make inequality today unimaginable in comparison if we get it wrong, because, we will have private ownership of labor, essentially. We'll have nothing, with which we can trade, right? Going on strike's not going to help us. And right, there's going to be nothing, nothing. So this is a critical challenge that we see up front. And I think we in the book talk about various mechanisms that we could introduce, to allow us to harness capitalism and end up, in that position. And actually that stellar world will outcompete, the butterfly will outcompete the caterpillar wings. If you had kind of three towns together, right? And one town was kind of the world of extraction, and one town was the kind of, you had these stellar technologies, but you still had the old governance structures, the whole, economic model. You have private ownership and you have central government, and then you have a fully stellar system, right? This system economically will outcompete, because you'll have zero cost here. You'll have a superabundance. You'll have cost here because capital and ownership require a return on capital. You won't have zero cost labor, zero cost energy, zero cost output. And so, over time, you would expect, a stellar world to outcompete any other, but it could be stopped just by the sheer power that's held by, private ownership of labor.
I really liked, actually, one of the solutions that you put forward in the book was the kind of patent model that we have today, which essentially, people can accrue the benefits for a certain number of years, and then over time, it essentially expires.
Yeah.
So in the same way, you might accrue the benefits from abundant solar, from artificial intelligence labor, but over time, that would then become shared ownership.
Yeah.
So we heard earlier, you go and have meetings, international meetings with important people. How are the conversations on this kind of topic land? Like, what kind of responses do you have to, China, Silicon Valley? How about we just put a patent on your AI and we'll all own it in 100 years? We'll share it. Share it?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the conversations we have are at the level of a kind of sector. So we'll talk to plenty of governments and plenty of businesses in the energy space or the transport space, and it's kind of granular, and you can kind of get your arms around it. Much harder to have a conversation about this, right? Because what we're basically saying is, if we're to be successful, somehow our political, economic, social structures will all have to transform. And we think about, Tony and I, when we talk about it together, we don't necessarily talk about it this way in the book. We think of kind of three levels of change. There's a technological change that's coming, right? And that's baked in already, right? We are, clean energy will outcompete fossil energy. It might be ugly. Fossil energy might hang on for much longer than it should do, but the economics and the physics of clean energy is just way better than the economics and physics of fossil energy. So that will work. AI and robotics will outcompete human labor ultimately. It will be cheaper and it will be better, right? And the sooner we face up to that, the better. It's inevitable. So the technological transformation is baked in. And the next layer is the sort of the organizing system, or we call the organizing system, the political, economic, social structures, the way we run the society. And that's not inevitable. Right, we need people out there building these systems, right, so we can begin to start outcompeting, right? If these systems never seed, they'll never get a chance to outcompete, and we'll just end up in this horrible dystopian system. So that's the second level, and that's more of a challenge. But the biggest challenge is really us, right, as humans. We'll need a transformation of us. We will need to leave behind our kind of extractive ways of thinking, our extractive behaviors, the kind of the greed and the anxiety and the fear, actually, and then somehow find a way to get comfortable during this period of change, with change, to kind of lean into it and welcome it, to become anti-fragile, which is my favorite word of the moment. It's Nassim Taleb's book of the same name, but it's a great concept that things are anti-fragile when they get stronger through stress. Right. And I think that's the kind of aim for all of us. But ultimately, we will need to go through that transformation and actually work out what the hell we're going to do as well, because we're in this world and we don't put too much color on this in the book. So we deliberately avoided writing too much about, what it'll be like to live in that world, because it's just such an extraordinarily large possibility space. And whatever we say is just going to kind of constrain people's imagination as to what that world might be like. I mean, you're in a world with essentially, unlimited energy, unlimited intelligence, to which we get it right, we'll all have access. You can do literally anything.
It's nice when you talk about the behaviors in the book, you really try to make the point that we're behaving in the way that we do today because it's competitive, because the extraction economy, we are being greedy and we have to keep growing and we have to compete. Yeah. Whereas in this other world, it's theory that should encourage other behaviors. And I think you also then talk about the last parts, how these two economies can start to run side by side. And actually, that's essential. Yep. To start to run a stellar world alongside an extraction world and start to demonstrate what that could look like. And there's this lovely phrase that you have, which is stellar nurseries. So let's say a bunch of us here this evening are really inspired. We get together, we're like, we would like to start a stellar nursery. We're looking around. How do we do this? What is it? And how do we do it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a certain critical mass, right, that we need. So we need a town or a city, to do this. But we would start with energy, right? And we could build the stellar energy system, relatively cheaply and relatively fast, right? And you need to find a funding mechanism for that. But actually there are, this is our aim in many ways, is to sell the vision and to sell the advantages of this. So if you think of the internet revolution, right, we went from a world essentially of constrained, centralized information provision, like communications, to a world where suddenly communications were super abundant, right? You could, for almost zero cost, you could send as much information as you wanted, anywhere. That was the internet. That's what it gave us. And it transformed from this centralized system to this much more kind of distributed system. Now, all of value was captured by by those who develop the uses and applications, right, of information, essentially, who built the platforms on top of the internet, right? And we think it'll be the same with energy, right? It's the uses and applications of that super abundant energy that are going to create the value. So actually, there's a real reason why a city or a region or a country, or even just a group of investors or businesses might do this, because if you're the first into that new paradigm, right, you can't develop those new use cases or applications, until you're actually in that world. And so, we think there's actually a kind of race to the top, or what we call a race to the stars dynamic at work here, that once someone gets going, there's real advantage in leadership here. So that's what you do first, is you do energy. The AI piece is kind of outside your control for the moment. But, AI in many ways is energy, right? It needs a huge amount of energy to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, I feel like I really want to make a plug for vehicle to grid technology and cars and Octopus EV and BYD and their partnership. But I will leave that to one side for a second. Questions. So let's put it out to you guys. So I feel like we've done a lot of talking now. Perhaps your mind has been blown. Maybe you've come across these concepts before. Who has a question? Okay, so the question was, how do we make sure that we don't overshoot the planetary boundaries before we get to the point of the stellar world?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a great question, and it's something we think long enough. So when we talk about, needing to focus time, effort, and resources on building this stellar world, and when I slightly dismissively talk about kind of the band-aids that we use to try and solve some of our societal problems like climate change, I'm not dismissing the importance of a lot of what we're doing today. Like, we are in this world of extraction. We live in the kind of economy that we do. And we have to do everything we can to make that system less bad, whilst it's our system. And I think it's incredibly important that we do that, and we don't trigger any of those tipping points. Because if we trigger those tipping points, it's kind of game over at some level. But those aren't solutions, right? They are band-aids, right? All the stuff we're doing, whether it's tax or subsidy or behavior change or anything else, so we're in an extractive economy. They are all band-aids. They cannot succeed. And so we have to recognize that the only way out of this extractive economy is a stellar economy, right? Where essentially the inputs are embodied. So we need to do everything we can to accelerate that and to build that as well. I think if we get there with energy, particularly, and labor or artificial labor, right, we can repair a lot of the damage we've done. If you had super abundant energy, suddenly carbon sequestration becomes viable. Right? Becomes, we could do it at grand scale. Energy is kind of the constraint to carbon sequestration right now. We had, almost unlimited physical labor and intelligence. Right? We could do all kinds of things, right, that would repair some of that damage. So it's critical. I mean, there's actually a part of the book where we talk about, want to go here now, the Fermi paradox.
You go for it, yeah.
So, Tony and I basically make the argument that, look, an extractive world, holds the seed of its own destruction. It's inherently unsustainable. And there's nothing you could do to make it sustainable. Right? It is by its very nature destructive. Right? And we've seen that through history. Every major civilization has essentially blown up. And I don't know if you guys are aware of the Fermi paradox. I mean, it's in the realms of science fiction at some levels, but it's a question that an Italian physicist asked, I think back in the 60s or 50s, was, if there are so many inhabitable planets out there, why haven't we seen kind of alien life? And there are all kinds of, proposed solutions. Either, they're hiding, or, that there's a gate through which we can't get, that all civilization basically destroys itself. And the point we make is, look, to survive into the very long term, a civilization has to be stellar. Right? It can't be exploiting the world around it. It needs to have embodied in the system of production everything that it needs. And if you become a stellar society, then the growth imperative and need to continually grow and continually hoover everything up disappears. Right? There is no further growth. You have no advantage to growth at that point in time. The only stellar societies can endure in the long term. And those stellar societies wouldn't need to go around pillaging other galaxies and other planets and so on into the future. So, the reason we might not have seen alien life might be to that. So that's a bit off track. But
just another thought, just quickly from the book, was also around how a lot of the efforts that are going in today to kind of bringing the world together to, agree to use less, to consume less, to produce less with fossil fuels is actually just not realistic in a growth economy, because we just need to keep growing. So there's that trade-off between growth and stability. And we, actually in this extraction economy, it makes things like the COP process very difficult to actually make really material progress. So when I was reading it, I almost took from it the more urgency to crack on with almost demonstrating a stellar world and making it really abundantly clear that you just need to go to that. And I think that's happening in so many ways. We see it a lot on EVs. Like, electric cars are just better. Like, they're just really fun to drive. So like, you just get out there, you make it look really good, and then people happen. And so you talk a lot around system change and getting people to that point where, it just then the border rolls downhill, and we've got to make sure that we don't try, change things where it's hard work.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the analogies we use in the book is we have this perception that we want to change the world in a certain way, right? We want to solve climate change. We want to solve inequality. We want to introduce electric vehicles. We want to, whatever. If what you're trying to introduce doesn't have a competitive advantage against whatever's incumbent, right? It's a sort of Sisyphean task. Right? It's like trying to push a massive boulder up a huge hill. Right? You need kind of every tool and all the power at your disposal. Right? You need tax, subsidy, you need behavior change, you need kind of everything. That's kind of our approach to climate. Right? But if you have something that's better, right, that outcompetes, that's cheaper, that's more effective,
more
beats
efficient,
across
more
every dimension, right? Yeah, more fun, exactly. Then it's like a boulder trundling down the hill. All you have to do is give it a shove, right, and it just trundles down. The job of government then becomes essentially to keep it on track and make sure it doesn't crush anything on the way down. I think that's kind of the great news in this transformation is, look, we don't have to wait for governments here, because God, if we do, we're all screwed, right? There's no way global governments are getting together to solve any of these problems. The great news is we don't need them to, right? We have kind of what we need, and it's a kind of bottom-up emergent process, right? This needs people, it needs business, and needs investment to deliver. But it can happen, governments certainly can accelerate it, right, and make it go faster. And they can get out the way and remove something, and they can probably slow it down as well. But this, it certainly doesn't need top-down intervention. And that's never the way change happens, right? It's always bottom-up.
And one of the things you talk about as well is protecting people, not protecting legacy jobs, which we're seeing quite a lot of at the minute as well, again, in the EV space, where it's, protecting legacy jobs over actually looking forward to creating this new, much more competitive economy.
Yeah. No, we try at the back of the book to develop principles, because, our view is, look, we don't know every step of the path, right? We can't write a kind of 10-year plan to go from extraction to the stellar world. It's an emergent journey. We're going to have to adapt and learn and experiment as we go along. But we can keep some principles in mind. And one of those principles is, protect people, not businesses, because there's going to be temptation. I mean, God, in your industry, can you imagine the German government letting,
it's tough. I think
BMW and Mercedes and BMW. I mean, these companies will be bust within 5 years, right? I mean, I have that's an opinion, by the way, but I have very little of that. I mean, it's the writings on the wall, right? The Chinese, will put up tariffs, we'll put up all kinds of restrictions up. It's going to be a really tough time.
Yeah. Jamie, if you get into much more locally,
I'm bringing myself in trouble for saying some of this stuff, but the point is that the German government won't let them go, and they'll waste a lot of money trying to prop up these industries. And every year it will get more expensive because they get outcompeted more and more by the Chinese and the kind of insurgency that's coming. And you can waste your time there, or you could just look after the people, right, who are affected by it, the people who lose their jobs, and invest your money in a way that's, presumably the only way we should be investing, but we'll do some dumb stuff. It's what's going to happen.
I feel like I'm demonstrating greedy activity. We've got question there, and we had another question down the front as well. So yeah, just in terms of the technology looking after itself, reference to the phone and data being unlimited now, whereas in the early days we had to pay much more, and we were much clearer on it. So what's the business model innovation, and particularly with abundant or near zero cost energy?
Yeah,
how's that going to look?
Yeah, no, we'll need people like you actually to come up with the solutions here. I want to throw it back at you in many ways. I mean, it's we need business model innovation, and we will see that. I mean, it's how do you organize that sector of the economy or that system, right? How do you organize the energy? That's the next challenge, because the technology's done, right? That's happening. We need the right kind of structures around it, including sizing it right? Having it, we talk about a kind of network and node model, which is kind of the model of the internet. And it'll be the same in energy. You have kind of self-sufficient nodes kind of interconnected with each other, rather than this kind of centralized system that we have today. So we'll need a ton of innovation. And that's the opportunity space, right? Some entrepreneurs are going to crank this, and they're going to make a ton of money, right? You can't do that in the current energy market, right? So, there's a kind of chicken and egg thing here as well. But someone somewhere will build that system, and out of that will come these innovations. And that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that we need to get on. There's a huge race to the top. And, I'm sure entrepreneurs like you around the world they're probably blind to this right now, because most people don't see the kind of system change that's coming. We're trying to innovate around the old system right now. But there's a huge opportunity for people who come up with the answers. And energy will be like, data, essentially. And it will be, essentially too cheap to meter. We'll have subscriptions and whatever else. And it'll be the total transformation, essentially.
So the first one was just around space travel. And if we had a stellar world, would we not be really curious to go and explore the rest of the world, not just the rest of the world, the rest of the universe? And therefore, would we not be more likely to see aliens because of the curiosity and the kind of, what else are we going to do? The second one being, the second one being around incumbents, and how do we stop them making it very difficult and basically blocking it and making it very hard.
Yeah. So the first one, we do in the book talk about, the only reason to explore space would be for curiosity. So totally agree. But we're trying to make the point that we won't be compelled. Right. And I think that's a sort of, I guess, the science fiction version is that, there's a compulsion to go out and dominate and pillage other planets. So I'm totally with you. But, that's way beyond my pay grade. So I can't go any further on that. The incumbency thing is a huge issue, right? There will be at every level incumbency. Tony and I we find it within us all the time that we're constantly caught out by kind of some of the extractive programming that sits inside our heads, right? That we as we're thinking about, how we go down this path or what that world might be. Everything we know about the world. I mean, there's an illustration at the end of part one, which, and a phrase which is, extraction is our water, we are the fish. But the point we're trying to make is that's all we know. So with the biggest part of incumbency is actually in our minds and how we think, right? Is our inability to kind of see that these new possibilities emerging, and our inability to kind of imagine a world, that functions in an entirely different way to the world we're currently in. So for sure. But as we take that path, it's incumbent interests, incumbent businesses, incumbent power structures that are going to resist this. But, as we try and stress time and time again in the book, disruption always comes from the edge. It's not BMW or Mercedes leading the transportation revolution, right? It was Tesla and BYD and a host of others who there's kind of an advantage to a blank sheet, right? You don't have any incumbency, any interest to stop you. And so, the only way we think this can successfully happen is for those at the edge, right, who have less incumbency, whether that's, India or Middle East or, towns or cities that have, self-governance that can build these systems and start that boulder rolling down the hill, right? It's only once we get these places in, to a stellar state, and they can start out competing, that the transformation will happen. So the answer is, how do we deal with the incumbency? Is, we outcompete them, right? We build something better. I think, going head to head, you just run straight into their world, right? And we've got to do what we can to remove those interests. That ultimately these are people in the incumbency, right? But we know trying to solve any kind of problem at the level of the problem, you run into all kinds of issues. So
I think you also do talk in the book, your point there, Amy, about whether or not, this might incur war. But actually, there will be tough times on this journey. That this is not a straightforward, let's build a stellar world alongside and everyone's going to merrily move over. Like, there's going to be struggle.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is not an easy journey by any means. And, the likely path is this kind of caterpillar with wings, right? That's where we're headed in most parts of the world, to this world where, this horrible dystopia, essentially. But, our hope is that if we get going early enough, we can find enough pockets that we at least see that other world. And, over time that grows and outcompetes. But yeah, for sure.
What's one of our other set members that sometimes comes along who loves AI recently told me that it's the age of the dreamer. And I really hope that this is the age of the dreamer. I really hope that dream of the stellar world is one that we can all look forward to, maybe with a bit of work by some of the people in this room to help us get there. I'd like to put our hands together for amazing Jamie for sharing her vision.
So thank you for tuning in. We loved having you here today. If you want to keep the conversation going, join us at one of our London events. You'll find all the details at www.earthset.co. And if you can't make it in person, just hit subscribe so you never miss one of these episodes. And a quick 5-star review or a share makes a huge difference, and it means that more people can get to access these ideas. Also, we'd love to hear what inspired you to come to this episode, or what feedback you got. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again, and see you soon.